So I'll get started. So I'm Tim Ashe. I'm the president of the Vermont State Senate. And as Joey mentioned briefly in the intro, I'm a member of our Senate Transportation Committee. Andy Perchlik, who's over there, who some of you listened to this morning, also on the Transportation Committee. And I would not normally mention, it's not distracting, Joey, don't worry.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's Murphy's Law, don't worry.
Okay, there we go.
I'm a Boston Red Sox fan, and if you have attended the Red Sox, especially in the old days before it got really fancy, if you sat in the right field grandstand, you had to crane your neck at all times because the seats weren't oriented towards home plate. So I'm going to ask that you look that way while Joey fiddles.
Sorry.
The reason why I did join the Transportation Committee is because for as long as I've been in the Senate and as an observer of the legislature before then, our transportation committees, both in the Senate and House, really focused primarily on paying for, maintaining, and improving infrastructure and making sure people could get safely from point A to point B. And obviously, there's a whole nother element of transportation, which I think both of their presentations touched on, that transportation needs to be focused on, which is the extent to which the way we make those investments, we're addressing our environmental impacts. And so the committee culture in both the Senate and House, I feel like, has shifted very rapidly. The legislature does not shift easily. And yet in the last year, there's probably been more discussion about the environmental side of transportation investments than had occurred in a combined decade before it. So both of the presentations, implicit in them was that TCI will not alone solve our transportation emissions challenges. However, I do believe that it is the most significant single thing that state government can participate in to achieve our environmental objectives on the transportation emissions side. And so I have long been an advocate for regional strategies. I think that the emphasis on the impact that Pennsylvania and RGGI will have really speaks to the power of banding together with other states. In Vermont, we have an ethic that says, let's do everything we can to do our part to fight climate change, but we know that to the extent our participation leverages states like Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Virginia to participate, it's an environmental benefit which dwarfs our own actions locally. It means that ours are important because banding together will achieve so much more. So I want to begin by actually saying something very positive about the current gubernatorial administration. I hope that isn't surprising, but I really do want to credit the administration right now. Peter is not the only one in the administration who's been working very diligently on Vermont's behalf at the table. Michelle Boomhauer from AOT, Dan Dutcher from AOT, and I'm sure I'll miss other people. But they're there with the governor's blessing to be at the table and try to see how this can work for Vermont. And sometimes I get very worried when I hear people's first instinct when they talk about issues like TCI is to make it about whether the governor will sign it or this or that. Right now, we should just be very pleased that he's got some of his sharpest and brightest environmental thinkers at the table doing work for our behalf. That's not an accident, it's a good thing, and we should celebrate it. Now, TCI, in terms of what happens when we receive this draft MOU on December 17th and what follows, I will confess we're all in a little bit of a learning curve here because it's not quite like RGGI in the sense that it's a little bit more expansive list of states at the table. It's a different type of emission source that we're trying to regulate, and they're not mirror images of one another. And the governor made a statement maybe a month and a half or so ago, which was a fair statement. He said, well, how can I be asked to say whether I'm ready to sign on to this thing until I've seen the details? And I think we all probably would say that is a reasonable position. And the legislature ought to go into its work with a similar mindset. That said, I am actually very optimistic. I am optimistic that if even the majority of the states that are at the table want to sign on to this deal, then almost by inference, it is a good agreement for the state of Vermont. So what the sort of vision is in terms of how the legislature is going to unfold on this issue, and my comments are actually going to be much briefer because I want to save questions for all the more technical questions that people might have. Spoken with the Speaker, the chairs of both the Senate and House Transportation Committees, and what we envision is the Senate taking up this bill first, Kurt McCormick, who some of you will know is the chair of the House Committee on Transportation and is very enthusiastic about taking up this work when we get it. However, it would be somewhat premature to have already submitted a bill since we don't know what the draft MOU is going to be. However, we have to start getting the work going. So I'm just going to briefly walk through what a draft piece of legislation, what it looks like, because I've already had it drafted. So it'll help you start thinking about, as the process unfolds, how you can weigh in to try to influence the outcome of events. The starting point, just so you can see here, the draft language, and at one point this will not just have my name on it, it'll be opened up to any senator who wants to join in. It's a very explicit purpose, which is to require that Vermont sign onto this agreement. I want to be very clear. I hope that the legislature and the governor jointly want to sign on to this agreement. The question of what happens if the governor elects not to is one that we will face when it comes, but I believe the legislature will be interested in proceeding if there's a good deal on the table with or without the governor's support. However, that would have to go forward like typical legislation, which would have to have sufficient number of votes to overcome a veto if that were the case. I don't even want to talk negatively like that right now, but that just gets to the issue of what happens if, which I hope is not the case. So the key statement, frankly, in any bill that we would do, especially since there's going to be a period of rulemaking and considering how we would spend the proceeds that were described by Peter and Jordan, is that the language explicitly says we shall join. That basically compels the agencies of state government to sign on with all the other states. Another key element of the draft legislation is the creation of a special fund. Well, special fund might sound like the most bureaucratic theme that I could bring up, but the key here is that the idea is we would create a fund that is separate from everything else government does, so that the money that's brought in is put in this one place that can only be used for the kinds of investments that you've heard described in terms of electrifying our vehicle fleet, other strategies to reduce the number of miles people are driving, getting people in public transit, and so on. So it would not be able to be used to cover other shortfalls in state government. It wouldn't be used to paper over other budgetary issues. So that is actually, in the legislature, an important thing, to essentially have a protected fund that can only be used for those important issues. These three themes, I will confess, they shouldn't look that surprising, but I basically worked with our legislative transportation lawyer to just identify these as the three themes that would describe any of the allowed investments out of that transportation fund. Reducing fossil fuels in the transportation sector, that seems pretty logical. Reducing emissions from greenhouse gases in the transportation sector seems pretty logical. And then one that I don't hear people talk about often enough, saving people money. Bear in mind, many of us care very much about fighting climate change. There are thousands and thousands of Vermonters who do not have the luxury to spend their time thinking about climate change because they're worried about putting food on the table. And yet we need to enlist those thousands of people in the kinds of changes that will actually reduce our emissions. So these can be subject to modification. That's why it's a bill as introduced. It goes through the process. But those three key themes, in my opinion, should drive all the decisions we make. And let me just say that for emphasis. For many Vermonters, it's the saving money that will get them to do the thing with the environmental benefit. We have to respect that, and I think we have to accentuate it as much as possible. Peter referenced, and Jordan, that there would be the creation of essentially a model rule in this agreement. Each state would then have to turn around and actually adopt those rules locally. This is a process that will not happen in 1 month. Rulemaking, which is often the way we implement the laws that we pass, takes a number of months. So we will have language in the legislation that formally authorizes the various agencies to proceed with all the rulemaking that's required to be one of the active participants in the program. These are some of the sort of guidelines of what that rulemaking should include. And again, these are just the beginnings of the legislative process and discussion. So the first one really speaks to the previous two presentations about being in conformance with what the TCI model rules are. The second is to make sure those funds are actually only used for the types of uses that are appropriate for reducing transportation emissions. And then third starts to get to the equity issues that were described, making sure that the money isn't just there for some narrow use which only benefits one subset of Vermonters. In some of the other jurisdictions, when they talk about equity, their conversation focuses not just on urban versus suburban versus rural, but communities of color that have historically received no investment for the infrastructure in their communities, elderly populations that have struggled to get to medical appointments and so on. So Vermont will have its own particular way of looking at that equity issue, but that is going to be particularly interesting, I think, to energy committees throughout the state, the transportation committees, which are sprouting up in municipalities across the state, because how you use the funds really is going to be a very difficult set of choices. This is not going to produce unlimited revenues from which we can make these investments. So we're going to have to make hard choices just like we have to do all the time. What I do know is that we are primarily interested in making sure that we are electrifying the vehicle fleet and making sure that people in rural communities have access to these resources to lower their bills for transportation while improving their environmental performance. So these are all themes that will be coming up in the legislation, and we'll work through the process. And one of the interesting challenges we'll have from a timing point of view, and I'll close on this. So a draft agreement comes out in December. There is then a stakeholder process through the TCI member states. In theory, there will be a final agreement for states to look at in kind of late winter, early spring. If that doesn't happen, the legislature is in a little bit of a pickle. We adjourn typically in around May, and we'll have to figure out how we deal with that issue. If it's not going to be an agreement that's ready in time for the typical end of the legislative session, there are some ways we can authorize, subgroups of the legislature to sign on, but this really is something that the whole legislature has to participate in. So that's one of the timing things that's actually keeping me up at night a little bit, is making sure that it gets done in time for the legislature to act. And if it's not going to, we have to come up with a strategy to figure that out. So I'll wrap there because I'm going to be delivering more expansive comments later, but want to save questions primarily for these two who I think are the technical experts.